Second episode of the Philosophical Pessimism series. Last episode we discussed philosophical pessimism, what it was in terms of suffering, and the difference between philosophical pessimism and common notions of pessimism. We also discussed antinatalism briefly and how it relates to philosophical pessimism. I really wanted to take this episode to elaborate more on what antinatalism is and specifically argue from my position on antinatalism, specifically the argument from Imposition, because there are many arguments and they're all valid in my opinion. They're all very much touch upon truths of the situation, but there's a specific one that I kind of hold as the main argument for my antinatalism, and we'll discuss kind of what antinatalism is and some main theories revolving around antinatalism. Okay, so what is antinatalism? Technically, it's pretty much a philosophical position that opposes birth, but specifically for ethical or personal moral reasons. It's not for things such as lifestyle choice. It's mainly around ethical or moral principles for not wanting to bring people into the world. And I guess it can be kind of summed up best by this quote here by Heinrich, I think it's Heine, is how you say that last name there, German poet. His quote is, "Sleep is good, death is better, but of course the best thing would to have never been born at all." And I think that really does sum up the antinatalist idea that bringing people into the world, bringing new people, children into the world is a ethically wrong or poor decision, and usually the reason is around suffering of the child that's going to be born, but there are other reasons. I'll get into that for this ethical position of antinatalism. It is not about a lifestyle choice. Not wanting kids for lifestyle reasons is just simply considered being child-free. And there is something called the child-free movement even. That is something about people in the age of childbearing who just don't want to bring kids into the world because it doesn't fit what they want out of life. Maybe they want their own hobbies, their own friends, their own, their work, things that they're interested in, and they don't want to be taking care of a child, and they don't want that lifestyle that parenthood and brings. So that's just a lifestyle thing. That's not the ethical position of not wanting to bring people into the world for reasons of suffering or other reasons that are ethically or morally driven. Basically, antinatalism is usually split into two different camps, two different major categories for what is motivating the beliefs in antinatalism. The one on the left is a list of things associated with misanthropic antinatalism. So just generally speaking, I should say misanthropic means that humans are being somehow bad to something else, and they're bad enough not to bring more of them into the world. For example, humans are terrible to other humans. If you look at history, mass murder, genocide, war, torture, rape, kidnapping, slavery, general mistreatment, bullying, just poor behavior we have towards each other, negative experiences all around how people treat each other in general, tends to be towards the negative end of the scale, either individually or just collectively. When we look at what we've done to each other, we've done just horrible, terrible things that keep happening, And so that's one reason for the misanthropic antinatalism. Another is We're terrible to other life forms. Billions of animals are killed and mistreated for food. People bring up, for example, factory farming or other agricultural practices which generally could be considered mistreatment or at least negative experiences for the animal. Another example with animals and other life forms is hundreds, maybe thousands of species go extinct each year because of how we essentially, when we take over a region or part of the world, a lot of life forms don't make it with where we habitate and how we treat the areas that we habitate. And finally, possibly one of the more important ones in this category, or one of the more primary reasons that people cite, is that humans are terrible to the environment, and a lot of degradation to the environment and leading to pollution, climate change, and things of that nature. Global warming, as you would know, that goes under climate change. So these are things that people cite as, hey, humans just add a net negative somehow to the world, and bringing more humans would be even more devastating, either for other humans that are born into it, to other animals, or to the environment. And there are probably other reasons in the misanthropic camp, but these are the major ones, I would say. But the thing about misanthropic and antinatalism is, in my opinion, as far as I see it, it's contingent on factors that could change potentially, but could change. An example of this would be if humans somehow weren't in the business of being terrible to other humans, if humans were not factory farming or killing other species intentionally or otherwise, if we weren't treating the environment terribly, well, possibly there would be room for having more humans, because they are no longer doing these negative things. So that is one form of antinatalism. I might even call it a soft antinatalism, because it really can technically change, although hard to, for misanthropic. So even though it says misanthropic, it sounds more negative than philanthropic. It does have, oddly enough, a hopefulness to it. Philanthropic antinatalism, on the other hand, and this is the camp that I would say my own arguments would fall under, that there really is no light at the end of the tunnel where if you just changed a few factors over time, it could actually go from antinatalist to being maybe at least indifferent or even pronatalist. So that's not going to happen usually with philanthropic antinatalism. It's usually a totalistic understanding of antinatalism as this is just wrong no matter what. And so here are some main reasons. There's more than this, and there's now the literature since the last 20 years, we'll say, has proliferated in this. So there are a lot of theories, but these are some general ones that most theories fall under. One of them would be philanthropic is argument from least suffering. So in other words, it mainly takes the form of negative utilitarian or some form of utilitarianism, whereby having children would be also bringing in suffering into the world. The least amount of suffering that one can bring into the world would be not bringing that person in the world in the first place, so that there's no one who would suffer. That's kind of the minimizing the most amount of suffering by not having people in the first place who will suffer. And of course, some might argue, well, I mean, what happens if they have a great life? And so that's where then you have more of the empirical arguments that no life is a charmed life, really, and that there are non-trivial forms of suffering that are always going to be present, and by bringing people into the world, you are bringing in more of that suffering and more of that harm. And if it's a totalizing utilitarianism where it's about adding up the sum of suffering of the greatest amount of people, so you have the most minimized suffering you can. And again, the action or behavior that leads to that would be not having children in the first place. That leads to the least amount of suffering. So that would be kind of your negative utilitarian. You might have maybe not totalizing versions of it. Maybe it is a individual version for the person being born without counting all of humanity or all collective people. The least amount of harm that you can do to an individual would be by not having them in the first place. So things like this would be maybe arguments for negative utilitarianism. Argument from asymmetry of good and bad in the absence of a person born. Now this one is a kind of a special case. I don't want to consider it quite negative utilitarian. It's really one of the paramount theories David Benatar thought of around, at least when he published his book in 2006, although he had a paper before that in the late 90s that the book was sort of based on. And the argument is essentially that there is an asymmetry between good and bad in regards to the absence of someone born. Now when someone is born, there's going to be good and there's going to be bad, right? There's going to be good events, good experiences for a person, and bad events, bad experiences. That's just a true thing that happens once born. However, in respect to someone not being born, no one is around to experience the good. There will be no one who is deprived of that good in the first place. Therefore, it is not bad if that person does not experience good, because there is no person that experiences good, and that is neither good nor bad. And so, really, there's no negative to no one experiencing good if that person to experience that good. Now, on the flip side, however, it is good that no one experiences bad. You don't have to have a person for it to be good in this theory, that somebody does not experience the bad of life, but it could have, but does not, has not been born to have actually experienced that. So it's kind of dealing with potential people that could exist but don't, and that it's good that someone didn't actually exist that would have suffered. I would say maybe the most controversial claim in this is Benatar does treat the not experiencing of bad as an intrinsic good. Not experiencing bad is intrinsically good, that bad is not experienced. It is, however, relatively good if good is not experienced. You do need someone to exist for good to not be experienced to be a bad, to be a deprivation. It has to be a deprivation for somebody, but it does not have to be someone is not experiencing the good of life. They don't have to exist for that. So there's an asymmetry, and I'll show you the diagram for that. I would say that's the most controversial, and because of the fact that there is an asymmetry there, and some people don't agree with that. I think it is actually a very powerful argument, but argument from dignity. So this is more of a deontological argument, meaning that there's something inherent about humans and maybe animals, that there's some sort of dignity about them, whether it's some sort of rationality or the fact that they're conscious or self-conscious, have a certain form of consciousness that gives them a certain dignity, whereby there needs to be consent for that person to have something done to them, such as the being born. Now, some people would argue from the argument of non-identity, where if they're not born, then, well, there's nothing that you're forcing into existence. If something doesn't exist, you can't be forcing nothing into existence. And I think that is a little bit of a sleight of hand kind of argument, not really arguing out of good faith, because even if the cause of of being born is prior to the actual birth of the person, right? The parents, which led to a human being born, even if it was prior to their actual conception and gestation and birth, it still was an event that led to an effect that will affect a person. So even if the cause was prior to the actual being born, the effect would have been the point in time when that person was harmed and consent was not had. You can separate the cause from the effect and still have this consent not being had by the person who is born. So there is still something happening to them at another point in time that happens maybe after the conception, but that point in time when they are considered born, whenever that you consider that to be, that is the time when their consent was not had. And so it's a significant event to be born, right? No one can be asked prior to birth whether they would want to have been born into this kind of universal setup that this existence offers. And maybe if you did have that ability, you would be like, nah, I'm not going to take that. Well, of course you don't, and you can't have that ability. But you should never assume as the parent that this is the thing to do, because again, you cannot get that consent, where in almost every other circumstance in these kind of important decisions you would want to get consent. Now, other arguments that would be against this would say that, well, a child needs to have his shots and go to school and has to be put in positions where they would not consent to it. And of course, in my opinion, what that's doing is you would have to split up the relative versus absolute thing here. The child is already born in the case of breaking consent, let's say, with that child. Their welfare is now in the parents' hands, and the parents have to make the best decision based on the welfare of the child, knowing that it's a child, until it becomes an adult, can make its own decisions. Once it becomes an adult, then of course forcing it to do something would be a consent issue until then. But in terms of being born, that's in a way an absolute argument, because now the child you cannot do anything about at that point. It is already born, unless you are going to do other harmful things and other deontologically bad things like neglect it and eventually dies, which of course would be terrible. So you don't want to create situations whereby you will be violating consent, and that's in a way an absolute thing. So you know that this is going to violate the consent, and therefore you do it, but you don't care, and so it's going to violate that consent in that regard. So that is different than the child. Well, the event happened where the initial consent was not had, but now there is someone who's at stake here, and now you do have to violate certain things that the child might not want because it's not an adult yet. And that's that argument. Now, argument from imposition would be a variation of argument from dignity. I would say they're similar, but there's a slight variation because the emphasis is on imposition rather than consent or harm. So that's the one that I'm really going to focus on, because that's the one I kind of have the most, that's to me the most compelling. Not that the other ones are not compelling, but this is the one that I would put at the forefront. Now, argument from imposition is that it's a deontological argument about imposing onto others and when that is acceptable, if at all. And the argument from imposition means that one is going to impose one's will onto another, and it means that one is going to create burdens for another, and whether that is okay to do. Whether creating impositions and imposing on somebody is something whether that is violating their rights, their dignity by doing that. So I'll go into that in a little bit. First, let me just go back a little bit about Benatar's argument for asymmetry, because again, this is probably the most read and known theory for antinatalism. Benatar argues there is a crucial asymmetry between good and bad things, such as pleasure and pain, which means it would be better for humans not to have been born. So he argues, he's got four main claims here. The presence of pain is bad. The presence of pleasure is good. So that's on the being born already side of things. Like if you're born already, you're going to have the presence of pain. That's bad. If you're going to have the presence of pleasure, that's good. That's Not usually debated too much. There are people like masochists and stuff, but again, then you could just say that their version of what good is, different, but it's still good, whatever. But yeah, so that is the presence of pain and pleasure being born. On the other side, how about the absence of an actual person? So maybe a potential person that could exist but doesn't exist yet. Well, in that case, the absence of pain is good for that, even if that good is not enjoyed by any actual person, anyone. So that is probably the most controversial claim of his, is that even if there's no one that exists to actually enjoy this, it is still intrinsically somehow good that someone who could have had pain in the world does not. So that is a claim that he's making there. And then the absence of pleasure is not bad either, really, unless there's somebody for whom this absence is a deprivation. So where the other one's intrinsically some sort of absolute good, this is only a relative good if somebody exists to be deprived, but they don't. So since there's no one who exists in this case, maybe a potential person, but never happened, there could have been, right? A couple could have had somebody, but didn't happen. Well, that absence of pleasure for that thing that was not born, that person that was not born, is not bad because they don't exist to be deprived. That is his argument there. That's the main Benatarian asymmetry. Let me go more into, though, what I was talking about earlier about the argument from imposition. Okay, so the pronatalist argument is, generally speaking, they think that life can be imposed on somebody. They are either, maybe they don't even think about this, but there's sort of an unsaid, unspoken idea that life can be imposed upon somebody else, that you can do something to somebody that will have an effect profoundly on them if, and here's where the faulty thinking happens, that X criteria of choices that the parents deem as acceptable is involved. What do I mean by this? So what I generally mean by this is that life has certain parameters that are de facto choices. There's not a limitless or unlimited amount of choices in the world that you can choose from once you're born. It's really kind of baked in there, de facto, as you will, that you will have to survive in some way by having to do whatever it takes in your society that you're born into, or that is available to you to be able to get by in life. So in modern Western society, if you want to use the word modern, if you want to use the word Western, we have what we call an industrialized type society, whereby you sell your labor or you own capital, and you sell goods and services, and you purchase people's labor, and you make a profit, or you make a salary, or you make a wage, and you use that to consume goods and services and utilities and houses and dwellings and things like that, so that you can live. And there's only a certain set of things you can really do to stay alive. Now, people say, but you have so many choices within your life once you are born. Oh, you have so many choices. You can be a businessman. You can be a doctor. You can be a professor. You can be whatever you want to be. And aren't there a lot of choices? So that's what the parents are thinking, right? There is some amount of choices, but there is only, you can't go beyond the choices themselves. You can't say, well, I don't even want to live in this manner of having to sell my labor to survive. I'd rather it be a different type of setup that doesn't involve this. Well, you can't make that decision to go outside those parameters. Yes, you have choices within that set of limited choices, but you can never leave those limited choices. So that's what I mean by X criteria of choices. You can never get out of the range of choices you have, whether it's for survival, entertainment, or for comfort, things like that. These choices are pretty much de facto just how it works to be a human in our world, based on the physical, social, cultural laws of how this world works. So that's the choices part. But parents think that X criteria of known harms are acceptable. So not only do they think that this limited range of choices that you cannot get out of is acceptable, they know that there's harm in the world, that there might be even terrible harm in the world, but they're willing to accept that the child will probably experience this harm, but it's good enough for that child, that it can't be, that they can take it, that it's, even if it's bad, it's not so bad that it would be never good to be born, that, even if they can't even get out of this harm, they know it's just going to happen to them in some way. Maybe they don't know it in exactly what amounts or when it'll happen. Maybe it won't happen at all to some people, but it's probably likely it will. That's why we call it kind of known harms here. They are saying that this is acceptable, that to impose on a person. Okay, so this is okay to do. So you're kind of maybe getting the shape of this argument that you, the parent, somebody else is thinking, know what is right in terms of what are the range of choices someone should be happy about. You should like these choices of life. You should, and the range of harms that they think are acceptable to experience. That's another thing there that one should consider. These are all forcing, in a way, or imposing, and creating impositions onto somebody. And I'll explain what the difference between imposing and creating impositions mean here. But even just saying these two things, these two impositions, things that you're imposing on somebody, then they think, well, they intuit there can be an acceptable amount of harm that someone else will suffer as an effect of their actions. So it's okay, again, with the choices to force this range of choices, these known harms, and it's acceptable, right, for them to do this. It's okay. That's their argument. It's the choices are good, the harms are not so bad, and they can make that decision for somebody else. They get to make that decision, they think. Okay. Well, this pro-natalist argument fails. Why? Because it involves what I'll call aggressive paternalism, and you can kind of see where I was getting at with it. The definition I'll say, and this is my neologism here, but I think it really does capture what's wrong here. It's the presumption that one knows what is meaningful, best, or good for another, when in fact they may be ignorant themselves. And what does that mean, ignorant themselves? Well, whether it's objectively wrong, maybe there is some, if you can get to the truth of it, what is wrong if the choices of life are too limiting for somebody, or the harms are too much to bear for somebody. Maybe that is an objective thing that you can determine, that this is just wrong. You should not foist these range of choices that they can never get out of unless they kill themselves, or these harms that they're just going to have to experience. Maybe it's just wrong. Or it doesn't matter if you don't believe in objective versions of this. Maybe it's subjective. It's simply wrong that maybe for this particular person that's affected, they would not appreciate these choices. That's just something also to consider. All right, the argument against aggressive paternalism essentially is, do not assume that you should create unnecessary impositions of conditions onto others, like the parameters of choices in the world one must choose from and encounter. Maybe you don't want to survive in the way this universe allows you to survive. You can't just jump to another universe with a different set of choices. You are stuck in this one because someone said these are the choices that are good for you. The amount of known harm that is acceptable. Again, maybe you don't like this harm that that is involved in this world. You could not have chosen that. It was imposed, and someone thought that this was good for you. And here's another one, the risk of unforeseeable harms. Now, maybe the parents knew that, yes, there's known harms that life is going to provide for, is going to have for people, but maybe they didn't see it. Maybe there's some things out there that are even things they didn't see, just horrible things, terrible things, things that you would never have thought of, or maybe not even terrible things, but just things that, oh yeah, that I didn't consider that one, but yeah, I guess that's there too. Things that they didn't know, and so the unknown knowns, or unknown harms, that's something also to consider. And they might know that they don't know it, but they don't know what those are, and that is another thing that's imposed. So again, argument against paternalism: by not acting on these assumptions for another person, no violation takes place. So by going ahead and acting on that assumption, a deontological violation does take place. Does not let the violation take place by not having a child. And in other words, do not act upon that aggressive paternalism, that assumption. And that's basically the main argument there. And just to kind of do a little analysis here, what is the definition of imposition? Well, life does not offer a personalized utopia. In other words, if you were to choose all the things that would make life a utopia, including changing things whenever you wanted to, that's something that to consider. This existence is not a utopia and would not be all the things that you would have wanted in it, how to survive, how it operates, any little change that you would have wanted to make in it, right? This is not a utopia. Therefore, if it's not a utopia, it will always be an imposition if someone else was to choose that this is what you should or is good for you. If you were never to be able to choose that option of a utopia, anything else would be an imposition. And there's two ways it is used. Both are relevant here. Imposition could be foisting one's will onto another, or imposition could be creating a burden for another. Imposition, when you're foisting one's will onto another, that's the part about assuming that you should do this and that this is good for somebody, that they should have these choices, that you can't move to another set of choices from, that they should have these harms. And creating an imposition also means you're creating a burden for somebody, so that what you are knowing that there's harms in existence and things like that. So just kind of keep that in mind, that these are two forms of impositions that are happening. There's foisting one's will, and you're actually creating the burden of not being able to get out of the choices of this existence, and also the harms of existence as well. Just going back to the three things that the parent is kind of assuming in aggressive paternalism, their argument for pronatalism there: assumed appropriate set of choices for another, known harms are assumed to be enough for others to endure, unknown harms are experienced by a person even if they didn't know, but they do know that there are things that they didn't consider but will happen to somebody. 2 and 3 are certainly a violation of the second definition of imposition that I'm using here, creating a burden for another. 1, it may seem like it's not a violation because assuming the appropriate set of choices doesn't seem to be imposing a burden, it's just foisting one's will of what the choices are. But maybe it is also creating an imposition because you cannot get out of that choice set, those range of choices of survival or whatever it is, the way the universe is set up, that you may not have wanted, your personal utopia that you did not have a say in there, that is also in a way a burden. So actually I would say all 3 are, even though definitely 2 and 3 are creating that second version of it. Certainly it is, but of course it is certainly a violation of A, which is foisting one's will. Both are happening in all 3 of these, or I would say arguable that both are happening in all 3. Definitely B is happening to 2 and 3, and A is happening to all 3. But I would say A and B might be happening to all 3 as well. So I would argue that could be the case as well. That's basically the argument here for imposition. I'd like to know what you think. Leave your comments. Create another video if you want, and discuss some of these points. And we'll go and hopefully have a good, lively discussion in some format. Hopefully, then we'll have another, continue the series here with another video. Thank you for watching, and thanks again.